Hello. In this video I want to talk about Aristotle's theory of forms and the way in which it impacts upon our understanding of things in modern physics, such as entanglement. Now, the idea of forms comes originally from Plato, of course, and we have the idea there that forms are transcendent entities, that they are things which exist non-temporally and which exist, as it were, permanently and unchanged in all time. The things which we observe around us are, in some sense, shadows of those permanent forms, those transcendental forms. In the Platonic theory, the forms have the foremost existence, and the things which we observe, the things around us, are something like shadows or approximations or non-substantial entities which partake of the forms. Now, that idea strikes many as counterintuitive. Plato adopted it because he wanted something which reason could grasp onto. If reason is going to get a foothold in the world, then he thought it couldn't have that foothold in the world of changing things which one could have no secure understanding of. Instead, he thought that it required these forms. Reason requires the forms for Plato. Now, his pupil, Aristotle, took a very different view of this matter. Aristotle, son of a physician, steeped in the more scientistic culture of the Ionians. He was himself an Ionian. This Ionian culture has more of a relation to what we would call science. It's a scientistic idea of the world, and so it relies on observations of things. So things become the primary things. Now, one view of Aristotle's idea of forms is what is called conceptualism. And that idea, it's a very common, popular view. Many people think that it is Aristotle's view and favor it because they think it is. The idea is this. In conceptualism, the idea, the forms, are really entities in the mind. They are concepts. They are definitions, if you like. So, for example, the definition of goodness might be a listing of particular characteristics which something might have to have in order to be good. The concept, the definition, gives us something which can be the form, but we can grasp it. Which it sort of, as it were, it allows the form, which is a transcendent entity in Plato's idea, to be assimilated to our conceptual understanding. So forms become mental things. It's a very common view. This idea has a consequence which would not have been favorable to Plato, or in fact even to Aristotle. And this consequence is this. If concepts are going to be, as it were, mental, and they're going to be spelled out in language, then we have this problem. Language is a finite number of terms. It has a finite lexicon. If it has a finite lexicon, then there are only a finite number of ways of putting these lexicon items together. The total number of permutations of all of these finite lexical entities would have to be finite. And if that's the case, then there can only be a finite number of definitions, since the definitions would be a subset of the finite permutations of all the lexical items. That means there can only be a finite number of forms. Now that, I think, would have completely ruled this out for Plato. He would have admitted that, of course, many of the things which you're interested in can be defined. That's, in a sense, an obvious thing. And Aristotle would have admitted the same thing, but probably would not have been happy with the consequence that there are only a finite number of forms. So conceptualism, though it's very popular, has a consequence which is undesirable, the finiteness of the forms. And I'm not sure that has been well appreciated. At any rate, I intend to put conceptualism aside for the moment, well, for this video, in fact, and simply to concentrate on the two genuine ideas of Aristotle's forms, and we'll see what comes of them. The genuine idea in Aristotle is not really conceptualism. Concepts play a role, as they would exactly for Plato, that, of course, if there are things, then we've got a handle on them. That's the idea. We've got a conceptual handle on them. But they don't define what a form is, and they don't limit what forms are. There can be undefinable forms. And it's not too difficult to find examples. Pi would be a good example for Plato and for Aristotle. So, what was Aristotle's theory of forms? Well, it rejected the idea of transcendental forms, and instead it based its idea on the primary things that exist as things, as objects, as what are called particulars, things that have thisness. So this is an obvious thing. It exists. It has what Aristotle called, or what was translated into Latin as, hoc aliquid. Hoc aliquid. Thisness. It has this something exists. Hoc aliquid. Now, things are then particulars, and these particulars have characteristics. Those characteristics are properties. This comes primarily from the structure of our language. So if we were to say, this pen is black, what we are saying is there is a thing, the pen, and it has a property, it's black. So our subject-predicate language gives us a distinction of things, hoc aliquids, and properties. And those properties are Aristotle's forms. They are things which adhere to the primary existence, which would be in this case the pen, and we get things which have the same properties. So another pen could be black, another object could be black. Okay? The blackboard could be black, etc. And so let's go to a slightly different example. An electron gives us a clearer example. This electron has the property of having negative unit charge. That electron over there has the same property. So things have the hoc aliquid. The things have a particular existence in that they exist, as it were, once in space and time, but the properties can be shared, and when the properties are shared, they are predicates, properties, and they characterize the things. Now that idea is called universalia in re or in rebus. Universalia in re or in rebus. That is the usual way of describing Aristotle's view of predicates. That the predicate qualifies the thing. The thing, the primary thing, is the pen. And as we just said, for Plato, that is certainly not the case. For Plato, there would be, this is something of a caricature and probably not accurate, but let me say it anyway. There would be the idea of a pen, there would be the form of a pen. It would be, that form would have this thing participating in that form. This thing also participates in the form of blackness, or blackness and goldness, if you like. So what Aristotle does, in a sense, is turn Plato's theory on its head. The primary existent is the object, and the predicate applies to it. It inheres in it. Now, that theory of Aristotle's has had a far-reaching effect. It conforms, and this is probably the most important thing about it, it conforms to the subject-predicate nature of our language. That's no small thing. And it lends to Aristotle's idea the idea that in some sense it's a natural theory. And indeed, it's felt by people to be natural in the way that Plato's theory feels like it's the reverse of natural. It's a very unnatural view. It's a very odd thing about the history of philosophy. It's one of the most striking things about it. It's not often said that philosophy starts with Plato in something which is really the reverse of what we could call common sense. It reverses the entire structure of it. So we have to feel that there's some kind of prehistory behind Plato, beyond even his acknowledged sources in Parmenides and Heraclitus. There has to be some older story there, maybe going back thousands of years, and probably going back into Anatolia, possibly even going back into somewhere like Sumeria, because it's such a striking idea, strikingly different from common sense. So let's go back to Aristotle. Aristotle has, in a sense, goes back to the structure of language as the basis for ontology, the basis for how we divide these things up. The primary thing is the thing, and it has properties. And those properties are things which inhere in this object. Now, if we rule out conceptualism because of its problems, then these forms, these properties exist. They are universals. And they are universals which, one has to say, Aristotle doesn't say much about them. He complains that Plato doesn't say much about his universals, his forms, his ideas. But Aristotle doesn't say much about them either, other than to say that, well, there are these properties. And that's one of the problems that we face in this. Aristotle is very good at criticizing the views of his forerunners, like Plato, and others, but he's less diligent in explaining what he thinks, other than simply saying that, and in a sense implying that, well, this is common sense and this is more obviously the correct view. His Ionian way of looking at these things is not, as it were, so much analytical as he's cataloguing things, and he catalogues objects in ontology as consisting of the something that exists, the hoc aliquid, and the property which adheres to the thing. Okay. Now, That's been the traditional view of Aristotle for a long time, but many people think that it's not correct. There has been a change of mind, certainly in the 20th century, as to whether it is the correct understanding of Aristotle, because of the problem that Aristotle doesn't really say enough himself about his own view to allow us to distinguish between that view and something which is rather similar to it. The similar view is this. It is now called a trope theory. Trope theory. It's this idea. It's that when the idea of Aristotle, the Universalia in rebus view, is that you have particulars, and those particulars have properties that inhere in those things. It's a dualistic theory. It has a duality of particular and property, which is, as I say, reflected in language. But there's always been this problem. How do the properties and the things relate? What does it mean to say that the property inheres in the thing? What does it mean to say that you have a thing which is somehow a separate entity from the properties? Well, that introduces the idea of a substance in Aristotle. Aristotle calls the particular, it has substance. And that substance makes the particular. But how do they relate to one another? How do these two different pieces of ontology, properties and substances, particulars, how do these two things relate to one another? That's been the puzzle, and it's given rise to enormous numbers of problems in that we don't seem to have a clear grasp on what a substance is. What could it be? How does it exist? It's not the same thing as, and you might fall into this trap, it's not quite the same thing as matter. Matter is a sort of similar problem, but it's not. Matter sounds like it's mass, and matter is not mass. Matter is something else. It's like substance. What that substance is really not clear. However, we've inherited this dualistic ontology from Aristotle of the properties and the substances or the particulars. We have a kind of dualistic ontology from Plato as well. Dualism seems to have been a fundamental feature of Greek thought, another thing that seems to go back in history. That is, as far back as you look, there is a dualism which is running through Greek thought, which has not really ever been, I think, properly traced out. So we come to Aristotle and we have now a different dualism, but it's still a dualism. And it's the dualism of particular or substance and property. Properties inhere in substances. Substances are the primary things that exist. The pen has a substance, and it also has properties. So, the alternative view, which has come along to try to solve this problem that you've got this dualistic ontology, is trope theory. And in trope theory, the predicates, the universals, the Aristotelian universals, are not separate or not of a different kind than the particulars. Rather, they are particulars. The theory that most people accept, well, most scholars accept, the Universalia in rebus view, where you have predicates and substances, or predicates and particulars, was called where you have, as it were, one thing, the predicate, the universal, present wholly and separately in each object. So take the pen again. The pen has this property that it's black. Well, it's black and gold. Just take the blackness. That blackness is On the Universalia in Rebus view, the blackness is entirely and wholly present in the pen. It is wholly present in the pen. It's not approximately present. It's not somehow, the pen is not an approximation to a form as it was in Plato. The predicate is entirely present in, the blackness is entirely present in the form, just as it is entirely present in the blackboard, just as it is entirely present in a smear of black paint. The blackness is entirely present in each of these instances, which are separate from one another. Now, it may surprise you, since many people think that's Plato's theory, it may surprise you that that's the theory which Plato says is the most impossible of all. You cannot have, says Plato, one and the same quality wholly and entirely present in two different objects in two different places. You cannot, says Plato in his late works, or in fact, in this case, it's in the Parmenides. So, what's the solution if that is going to create trouble for us? What if that standard interpretation of Aristotle just creates trouble? Well, the better interpretation, many people have thought, is to go with the idea that the particular is not a universal, independently present in many things. Instead, the predicate in this pen, the blackness of the pen, is that blackness is itself a particular. It is only present in this pen. This blackness is not present in the blackboard or the smear of black paint. That would be a different blackness. Blackness here is not something that we shared. The penness, if you like, a penness is not the same here as it is in another pen. You may say, well, that's more obvious because a Bic ballpoint would not be the same as this. Right, well, now you're getting the idea. So the trope theory says things have properties, but those properties are particular to the object. And that's how we make sense of Aristotle. One of the first people to make this case was a philosopher by the name of Elizabeth Anscombe, and that's the book. 3 philosophers, Aristotle, Aquinas, and Frege. And it's 3 essays written by Elizabeth Anscombe and Peter Geach. And Anscombe has the long essay, 70 pages or so, on Aristotle to begin the book. And it's well worth reading. It's an excellent essay on Aristotle, rethinking him from the ground up as a trope theorist. The term trope is a later term. She probably would have used the term Stoutian particular because G.F. Stout came up with this theory of particulars long before D.C. Williams came up with it in the 1950s, who coined the term trope. Here, Stoutian particulars were formulated in 1910, 1911, and Anscombe's view is essentially that Aristotle holds to a Stoutian particularist view of Aristotle, and that that's the correct reading of him, that he doesn't have the view of universalia in rebus. Instead, he has the view that the predicates are Stoutian particulars. G.F. Stout is one of the foremost Oxford philosophers of the 20th century, and his theory of abstract particulars, which is another name for tropes, abstract particulars, Stoutian particulars, all of this was really first formulated by Stout. Now, here we have then two different views of Aristotle, and in fact two interpretations of him which we can work with. Which is true? Which is the better theory? Well, both theories have currency, both theories have, I think, interesting things to say. The trope theory has become very popular in modern metaphysics, and it's worth a talk in itself. But here I want to just simply treat it as a theory of Aristotle. And I want to say something against it, which I don't think has been said. In what this theory, this interpretation of Aristotle gives us is essentially a world of only particulars. There are no universals. There are no things that are shared from one thing to another. It leaves this gaping problem, namely, well, if the blackness in the pen is a completely different blackness than the blackness in the blackboard, why do we regard them as similar? What's the similarity? Why do we categorize them in the same way? What's the commonality that they have? There doesn't seem to be a very good answer to that question. So, to this extent, we seem to be back, as it were, to the drawing board. A world of only particulars, which Williams and Stout thought was an advance on a dualistic world of particulars and predicates, particulars and universals. This idea also seems to have problems. And I want to say, I think that it is wrong, and that it looks most wrong when it comes to modern physics and quantum mechanics. I suggest that the better way of resolving the problem would be to say something like, particulars don't exist, the only things that exist are universals. Particles are universals. Quantum particles are universals. They are not particulars. And I want to say this, the idea of particular is that it exists only in one place and one time. So that when you have a particular, it exists somewhere. The pen, because it has thisness, it exists here and now. But it also existed 10 minutes ago, 15 minutes ago, when I was exhibiting it in the same video. That seems an odd thing. Surely, if a pen can exist in many times, as the time goes forward, and I can assure you it existed years ago, not just in this video. If that's the case, why can't it exist in different places? Why is this asymmetry between places and times? Well, that seems to say something against the idea that the properties and the thing are all particulars. Indeed, if we answer that question by saying, well, the pen can exist in different places at one time, just as it can exist in the same place at different times, then we're looking at a universal. The pen would then be a universal. Now, we, with the structure of our language as it is, seem almost fixed into thinking of particulars and universals in this way. Dog is a universal. Person is a universal. Blackness is a universal. In our language, that seems to be the case. So there's this motivation for holding something like the dualistic universalia in rebus theory. But what if we say that everything is a universal? Well, then we should say that the pen can exist in different places at one time, in analogy with it existing in one place at different times. Now, when we come to quantum mechanics, that is indeed what we should say. Because in the two-slit experiment, when the electron goes through the two slits, or photon, or whatever the particle is, when the particle goes through both slits that are open, in a sense, it is in two places at once. And our thinking against that, our thinking that, well, something can't be in two places at once, that doesn't make any sense, is, I suggest, an obstacle to our understanding quantum mechanics. We fall back on the idea of something, a thing, being a substance which can only exist in one place at a time. That is our default way of thinking. But an early pioneer in quantum mechanics, in my view, one of the great pioneers in quantum mechanics, who understood it, I think, before almost anyone else, was Hermann Weyl, W-E-Y-L. Hermann Weyl in 1927, that's two years only after Heisenberg really formulated quantum mechanics in the way that we currently understand it. In 1927 said this, that one can't understand an electron as something like a hard billiard ball, a small hard billiard ball that is being pushed around by forces, that's not what particles are. And I think he was right in that, dead right. We're 3 years off the 100-year anniversary of this revolution in our way of thinking. And the problem, I think, in philosophy is that we have not caught up on that revolution. We hold on to the idea of particulars as being the fundamental things, and as of either having universals, properties, predicates applying to them in the Universalia in Rebus theory, or as having only particulars in both the substance, the particularity, and also in the predicate. That's the Trope theory. We're caught up in this, and we haven't gotten beyond it. Metaphysics hasn't gotten beyond it. But it looks very wrong in terms of quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics does not look like it holds to this kind of dichotomy. And we should have given it up 100 years ago. We should have given it up 100 years ago. And we haven't. We have replicated it. Why? Well, the problem in philosophy is that very early on, in the 1920s and 30s, particularly, was finalizing the idea of logic. And what do you get in logic? Well, you get the idea in quantified logic that there are entities, things, and those things have properties. So the properties apply to the things. We understand the things in virtue of which properties apply to them. We quantify over the things to understand how quantified sentences imply other quantified sentences. This discovery of quantified first-order logic, which is what almost everyone is taught when they are taught logic in a university, it is, if you like, the great foundational theory in 20th century philosophy. If you're not getting that theory, you're not getting a proper education in philosophy, because it's applied then everywhere. The problem is that quantified first-order logic may be foundationally wrong because it relies on this universalia in rebus dichotomy between things and properties. And if I were to say what I think is going on in quantum mechanics, I would say there are no things, there are no particulars at all. There are only universals. One universal, we can say one universal is the property. For example, every electron has the same mass, every electron has the same charge, those things look like more or less stable universals. And they exist exactly duplicated as a universal from one thing, from one electron to another. They differentiate the particles because protons, of course, have different mass, positive charge equal to the negative charge of the electron. But it characterizes them. And then we have other properties which look like they're more quantum mechanical things. They are based on something else. They are based on the state of the system. Now the problem is, even when we say this, it's the state of the system, it seems to bring in the idea that the system is a substance, a particular. And that is, I think, deceptive. That is something which we should not hold to. But if there are only universals of the form more or less stable predicates properties, like mass and charge, and quantum mechanical entities, like states of a system, where of a system is, as it were, a phrase that we are using without any sort of substantial meaning to it, but a state, then that state is another universal. The same state could apply to another thing, and it has a very complex relation to properties through measurement. Measurement takes that fundamental, as it were, summing up of the potentia of the object, which is the state, and turns it into something definite. That idea is irreconcilable with the ontology of things as particulars at all. Things should not be conceived of as particulars. We should give up that entire ontology. But that is the hard problem for philosophers, is that means completely refiguring how logic is going to work. Because the things that are the basic things you quantify over in quantified, first order quantified logic are not going to exist. They are chimeras. They are ghosts. The properties exist, and there is something called second order quantified logic, which quantifies over properties, but it quantifies over things as well. That's the problem with that. We need something more. Now, in entanglement, this problem really comes to the fore. It comes to the fore in the two-slit experiment, but it comes to the fore in all other places in quantum mechanics, including entanglement. The fundamental problem of entanglement is a problem of particularity, of our reading particularity into the situation. So let me just say what the basic idea is, just with two particles. Suppose two particles are created in a way in which their spins are correlated with one another. So the total spin of a system as you create it, two particles, is 0. Now you allow these particles to go far apart from one another. There are two experimenters situated far apart. One is called Alice, one is called Bob. Now, imagine that far off in that direction, Alice measures her particle when she gets it. She chooses an orientation for the device, which is, she can choose at random, and she gets a response from the particle, which is either it's spin up or spin down. It's not 0. It's spin up or spin down, because that's what electrons are. They're spin up or spin down in that direction. Now, people will say this differently, but what happens then is if Bob were to measure his particle all the way off to in his part of the world, if he were to measure that in the same orientation as Alice chose for her device, and Bob may just choose that randomly, or he may have some kind of correspondence with Alice as to what she's going to choose. If Bob hits upon that orientation for his device, he will get the opposite to what Alice got. If she got spin up, he will get spin down. If she got spin down, he will get spin up on that same orientation. And there is a probabilistic, if there is a slight difference in the orientations, then you can work out what the probability is of getting a correlation of some kind between Alice and Bob. Now, this whole idea was initiated by Einstein in a paper by Einstein, Podolsky, Rosen in 1935. Can quantum mechanical something or other be considered complete? Now, the idea looks paradoxical because Alice and Bob can be very far apart, and Alice and Bob can make their measurements very, very quickly with respect to one another. They can make them virtually simultaneously. That seems odd. How can there be any relation, any interaction between these two things if it can happen almost instantaneously with respect to one another? Well, it's odd if you consider the two particles as being separate thisnesses, separate hoc aliquids, which don't have a clear relation to one another, which look like they're separated in space and therefore look like they are no longer connected to one another. The answer is they are connected. They are connected. And indeed, we have no reason to suppose that Alice didn't receive, in some sense, both particles and measured one to get a particular result. Just as Bob could have got both particles but measured the other one as a result. Now, I don't want to be too, I don't want to make this sound like literally it's the same pair present in both parts, because that's also going too much with the idea of the thisnesses were as duplicated. That's not the right view. It's not that one thing is in two places at once as in the way that we would ordinarily think. That's not the picture. The state is a complex valued structure. It exists to have complex values in it. And that means to have a whole imaginary structure built into what it is. And what I'm suggesting is that that whole complex imaginary structure somehow is continually connecting these two particles together in a way which makes the particles not understandable as particulars. Some people will hear what I'm saying as, well, that's obvious. Others, I hope philosophers, will hear this and think, well, this is fundamental then. We can't think of there as being these separate things. We can't think of there as being things with properties at all. Therefore, we need to have a new logic which is going to understand and comprehend this new situation. And that this new situation has one thing, the state, the quantum state, which is a complex, structured, valued thing, a very complex object, and also more stable properties, which are properties of, at least of space and time. Space and time may be a particular. That is, if there are any particulars here, the only one that may be is space and time. And by the way, that view that one could have only universals and only space and time as the particular goes back to the 1910 essay by G.E. Moore. G.E. Moore suggested something like this, but also rejected it because he thought it was horrifically against common sense. And by the way, it was also way before quantum mechanics was formulated, so he didn't have even that to suggest that it might be true. That's the idea. So from Aristotle, you get this view, and then from there, it seems to me we have to go a completely different way to Aristotle, and that way is to embrace universals and to think that they are the fundamental objects, but that they are complex valued, and that the structure of them is not simple. But there are only, there's space-time, and then there is states and more stable properties like charge and mass. And that's it. And what we urgently need is a theory of logic which reflects that structure, because it's standard quantum mechanical structure. But our logic does not fit it. Recently published a paper which argues that if that's true, then the theory of our understanding of truth is also wrong, because it does also relies on that same, the Tarskian theory relies on that same first order logic idea of you having things quantifying, which you're quantifying over, and then also properties. All of this must go. All of this is up for grabs, or should be up for grabs. And we philosophers have had 100 years to catch up to this matter, and we have done what I must say is an abysmal job of doing so. Thank you.